The internet ecosystem. So first, thank you to APSIG for inviting me here, to inviting us here to interact. I can see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. A lot of them are ISOC members, and for those of you who are not, you will be before you leave here today. I can assure you of that. Okay, so the internet governance ecosystem. So let me start with a question. Anyone care to tell me what an ecosystem is? What's an ecosystem? Anyone? Come on, you guys must be fresher than I am. I just got off a flight. I didn't sleep all night last night.
The stakeholders and the environment surrounding it.
No, an ecosystem. What's an ecosystem? Generically speaking. Don't think about the internet, just the ecosystem.
Stakeholders, living systems.
A living system?
Between the different actors of a system.
Okay, but
Connection of systems.
okay, that's sort of getting there. What else?
All can coexist.
All can coexist. Yes. Always in harmony? Not necessarily, right? And what's the other thing that always happens in ecosystem? Change is always constant. Things keep on changing. And I think that's what we have with us when we talk about the internet ecosystem. Now, I've been floating around the internet ecosystem for 20-something years now. And in those 20 years, and of course, Professor Chon has been there for far longer than I have been, but in those 20 years that I've been involved in the internet and its various structures, there's been tremendous change. And that change really has been driven by the fact that the internet today is very different to what it was when it was invented in the late 60s, early 70s, and then when it came into the mainstream globally, let's say roughly around the early 90s, and to what you have today. You know, some of you in this room, I'm sure, will remember we had to go through many difficulties to make a simple connection, make a single link, be it via modem, you know, and if it was 28.8K, it was a lot, it was fast, because we were coming from 14.4K or 9.6K, which are very, very slow systems compared to what we have today. Closer? Okay. So, you know, so the only thing constant is change. That's what I like to say about the internet governance ecosystem. One of the what I was trying to drive from you guys by asking that question is to try and just give you an idea of what is composed within that ecosystem. Just like any ecosystem, the environment, for example, there's many things that make it up. But the most constant thing about the ecosystem is that it keeps on changing. It never stays the same. And if we were having this discussion 20 years ago, the internet ecosystem looked very different. If we have this conversation 20 years from now, it's going to look very different again. There will be many, many different players, people we don't even know right now, who will be part of that ecosystem. Now, one thing that has really defined the internet ecosystem, if I can call it that, is that it's been following what's called the multi-stakeholder model. Now, if you look at the traditional model of governance, which is the multilateral or government type of governance, where it's basically a top-down approach. There's a group of people who make the decisions, and that flows down to the rest of the population. With the multi-stakeholder model, of which ISOC is a very strong proponent, but as are many, many other organizations in the internet space, it allows everyone to have a discussion, a dialogue. It allows everyone to have a seat at the table to discuss the issues which is dear to them. And a civil society may have their own concerns, the technical community may have their own concerns, governments may have their own concerns. So this multi-stakeholder model is what really makes the internet governance ecosystem that we have today work. So I don't know if there's a point in this. So the key thing is that, you know, there are shared goals. Now, all our goals may not be the same. We may not always agree with what the other says, but we know that the common objective, the bigger picture, is a shared goal. In this instance, of course, the internet itself. Now, this is a graphic that was produced by the Diplo Foundation. Some of you perhaps are aware of the Diplo Foundation. Maybe some of you have done some of their courses. Diplo and the Internet Society collaborated on some online training many years ago. And part of that is today what we call our online learning program. Obviously, both organizations have evolved and developed since then. But a lot of the material you'll see me present today was jointly developed by us. the thing about internet governance, and I believe this morning you had a session in internet policy principles, so I'm sure you're all up to scratch on what internet governance is and what some of the policy considerations are. So I won't talk about that, but you need to understand that the reason we have the internet governance itself is very varied. There's no one little thing in internet governance. There's multiple things. And each year, in fact, I would say nearly every month, there's something new that comes into it. As an example, if we look at the Internet Governance Forum 2006-2007, when it first started off, there was very little discussions around cybersecurity in those meetings. There were some discussions, but not, it never really dominated the agenda. But if you look at internet governance meetings today, cybersecurity is probably top of the agenda. Privacy issues are top of the agenda. And the reason is because new players have come in, new things have happened within the ecosystem, which now require us to turn our attention to what is an area of most need. Now, there are many players in the internet ecosystem, and of course, there are many issues. So to the right, you see that house being built. That's the house of internet governance. And to the left, where you've got that crane, below that, there's that list of various organizations and entities which contribute to that building of that house. And when we talk about internet governance stakeholders, of course, it's that red square on the left there who we're talking about. And we'll expand a little bit about that as we go on here. Now, this was a graphic that was produced by the Internet Society several years ago. There are many variations of these. ICANN has got a version of this, but fundamentally, it talks about the same thing. You have the ecosystem, and then you've got the parts that make up the ecosystem. Now, there's 6 categories, if you like, that we have put into that internet ecosystem: naming and addressing, open standards development, shared goals, shared global services and operations, users, policy development, and of course, education and capacity building. Now, as you see, if you expand that out, there are many entities and organizations that are involved in all of those as well. I mentioned before that the traditional mode of governance has been a government-led approach or a multilateral approach. For example, if you look at an ITU meeting or a UN meeting, it really follows the multilateral model where governments have a seat at the table, they have a discussion, they make some decisions, and then it flows down to the rest of the population. In the internet multi-stakeholder model, we have not just governments, but all other categories of stakeholders who also have an opinion, who also have a discussion, a debate, so that we can meet that shared goal, that shared common objective, which is to ensure the internet keeps on growing, it keeps on evolving, and it gets, it gives us all those little luxuries and those little pleasures that we get out of the internet. But of course, with that, there comes issues and problems as well, which then, having these various actors involved in that discussion then gives us the opportunity to have a deeper discussion on some of those things. Our government or the technical community may not have all the data, may not have all the background or the context or the information to help make those decisions. That's why we need everyone to play a role. Okay. Have you guys seen that before? Any of you seen that before? Some of you may have, I'm sure. Yeah? Okay. If I were to ask you, I want to try and make this a little bit interactive. I know we're live streaming and all that, but I think instead of me just talking the whole 90 minutes, let me try and get a bit of interaction going so that you guys don't fall asleep. I know it's after lunch, eh? So, out of all those that you see, standard, oh, something's happened here. You want to fix something? Or? Is it okay? Yeah? I can hear myself 3 times though.
Let me adjust it. Just keep going.
Okay. So let me step back a little bit so it doesn't go in. So if you were to see that graphic, and I hope you can make out what the little text is around the sides. There's governments and things here. There's individuals, businesses. There's the technical mumbo jumbo that makes the internet work. There's standards bodies which create the standards which make the internet work. There's the administrative bodies who are under naming and addressing, people like ICANN. I don't know, some of you I know are involved with ICANN. Which do you think is the most important category out of those? Anyone care to take a guess? Spot on, users. Because if there are no users, the internet will not exist. Okay. No users, no internet. Because if no one uses the internet, then what use is all this? And then a lot of money is spent developing stuff, doing stuff, going to conferences, running conferences, building companies, building applications and services. But if you have no one that uses those services, nothing's going to happen. Okay, so well done. You're from Vanuatu. Okay. Which category do you think thinks it is the most important out of all that?
The local, national, regional, and global possible. The governments.
Governments like to think they're very important. Of course, they're important. They run countries. But in this model, government is just one stakeholder. Right? And I think over the last several years, what's happened is slowly, not all governments, but many governments have come around in their way of thinking to realize that, it's not just us making the decisions, but we need to make a collective decision, a collaborative decision. Which category do you think is the least, they have the least input, or people don't really care about that group? Which one do you think that is? So this middle group seems to be the most awake, and the two on the side seem to be
Technical.
standards. Okay, so we've got standard, we've got global services is all the infrastructure, right? The telecom companies, the ISPs, and all that sort of stuff, right? So, someone said technical?
People don't care. And capacity building.
Capacity building? Open standards development? Okay. I would say it was the same thing my friend from Vanuatu said. It's the users again. Because how many users have the opportunity to provide input into these processes? Okay. Although quite a large number of organizations, including ICANN, IETF, APNIC, etc., they said that we have an open policy process that anyone can contribute. But how feasible is it for you to do that? No? Exactly. I mean, there's time, effort, resources. You probably have a job somewhere else. Can you really afford to travel to, let's say, Europe or somewhere for a meeting? Who's going to pay for that? You'll have to take time off work. So users, although they are the largest category, I mean, if the users didn't exist, the internet ecosystem would fail. Still, their input is still far lesser than what it should be. We have various institutions within what we call the ISTAR group. So do you guys know what the ISTAR community is? Yes, some of you do. Anyone don't know what ISTAR is? ISTAR? Everyone knows? Confusion? Okay. So there were a number of organizations which were involved in the early history of the internet. There are organizations such as the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF. There's the Internet Society, where I'm from. So I should also say that ISOC is the legal and organizational home for the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, as well as the Internet Architecture Board and a few others. We'll expand on that a bit later. Then there's ICANN. Then there's the regional internet registries. For us in the Asia Pacific, it's APNIC, based out of Australia in Brisbane. In Europe, for example, and part of the Middle East, it's RIPE. In the US, it's ARIN, etc., etc. So, these, then they're the top-level domain, the country code top-level domain, for example, .th for Thailand, .in for India, .us for the United States, which isn't used all that much because they seem to default to .com, .uk for the United Kingdom, etc., etc. So those are CCTLDs, the country code top-level domains. All these organizations are loosely called the ISTAR community. So these are the technical organizations which have been involved with creating or building, helping build the internet as we know it today. They're not really involved in the application and services side. It's more the back-end stuff, all the infrastructure, all the things, all the nuts and bolts that make the internet work. So that's loosely called the ISTAR community. Every so often we meet at various events. Sometimes we have specific meetings if there's an issue to be discussed. But what you will see is there's a lot of collaboration between the ISTAR community. And what you also normally see is that you've got the ISTAR community and then you've got the telecom community, which seems to be separate, and there's very little overlap. It's getting there now, but historically there's been very little overlap between those two. The problem being, of course, that today most of the infrastructure that we have, well, in fact, that's not true anymore, is it? We've got Google now building fiber networks around the world. So the lines between what a telecom company is and what a content provider is and what a services provider is getting very, very blurry now. And I think that in itself raises a challenge for regulators, of course. And hopefully later in the week, you guys will have an opportunity to discuss those things. So I won't get into all that, but maybe we can talk about it in a break or something. So the point being, the avenues for users to contribute to these discussions is very limited, largely because there's a cost associated with that. How do you go and do that? Now, one way out of that is, organizations like ICANN, as ISOC as well. In fact, there's a few ISOC chapter leaders in this room as well. One of the things they do is try and provide input into this policy processes because they typically represent a group of people, a group of community in a country, in a city, etc., etc. Similarly, ICANN has what's called the RALO structure, and maybe Satish can talk to you a little bit about that since he's the current chair of AP RALO. That looks at the user input into ICANN's policy processes. IETF doesn't actually have a user community as such, but anyone can join their mailing list, which is where most of the work is done. But of course, it's highly technical work. It's developing standards for the internet. So you may not really be all that interested in that sort of stuff. Okay, so enough about that. Let's try and expand a little bit of those out. So I talked about the naming and addressing resources. So these are your IP addresses. Everyone know what an IP address is? Yep. Everyone know what a domain name is? Okay. Why do we need the domain name system? Anyone? Right.
You can remember names, but you can't remember all these long numbers.
And imagine if we didn't have the domain name system and we moved to IPv6. Have you guys seen how big an IPv6 address is? Right? So either you have a very good memory or you'd probably find another way to do it. So that's why the domain name system is quite important. We also need to protect the domain name system. Okay, so there's lots of issues around that too. And again, I hope you guys have had some opportunity to read about that, and you will have further opportunities to talk about that later in the week. On the right-hand side, you can see all the regional internet registries. So there's ICANN, which runs the names and numbers. Within ICANN, it's not within ICANN. So there's another entity called the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, IANA. If you had been following news over the last couple of years, there was a lot of discussion about, so traditionally or historically, IANA has been under the control of the United States government, and very particularly the Department of Commerce. Late last year, was it September last year, I think, that contract, it was left to expire, and then ICANN took over the management of that as a multi-stakeholder body. And again, there's lots of ICANN junkies in this room who can talk to you all about that process, and it was a very lengthy and tedious process that people went through to make that happen. So there's the domain name side of ICANN and there's the numbering side. But the actual allocations for those numbers happens via what's called the regional internet registries. So as I said, for the Asia Pacific region, it's APNIC based out of Australia. For Africa, it's AFRINIC. For the US, it's ERIN. So these are all the names I'm reading up off here. It's RIPE NCC for Europe and the Middle East, and LACNIC does the Latin America and the Caribbean. They have a very important role to play. But again, their remit is very, very narrow. All they do is hand out IP addresses. So if there's an ISP or a telecom company or a university that needs to set up an IP network, they need to have a set of addresses allocated to them. So they go to the regional internet registries. Some countries, for example, India, China, and a few others, have what's called national internet registries, NIRs. So that allocation process, it goes from ICANN IANA to APNIC, APNIC to China, and then the Chinese registry will then allocate within its own country. Although, like in India's example, it's possible for an ISP to go direct to APNIC as well, but I think there's been a big shift now towards going to the Indian registry as opposed to APNIC. Support is easier, right? It's in the country, it's in your time zone. And of course, there are many, many other reasons behind that too. And you all know what IPv4 and IPv6 is, right? Okay, right? Now, one of the reasons the internet has been so very successful is because of the standards that make it happen. The IETF standards are openly accessible. If you want to be a part of the IETF, there are no membership fees. You join the mailing list. If you want to attend a meeting, you go and attend the meeting. Obviously, there's a registration fee for the meeting, which you pay, and you go and attend the meeting. They meet 3 times a year around the world. Usually it's once in Europe, once in the United States, and more or less once in Asia Pacific in recent times. Although historically that wasn't the case. It was usually between Europe and the US. But now that they realize that the internet is very global, and therefore, of course, you have to move across the regions. They also had a meeting in the Latin American region last year. Africa hasn't had a meeting yet, an IETF meeting, but perhaps in the near future there will be one there too. So open standards are very important because it gives people the ability to build what they want using those standards. Now, if you look at the traditional standards development system, for example, ITU or IEEE, which I'm also a member of, and I've worked with IEEE standards as well. But to be a part of IEEE standards making, you need to have a type of membership. So the Standards Association, SA, you can either be an individual member, which costs money, or you can be a corporate member. And depending on your level of membership, it gives you certain rights on what you can develop. So everyone knows Wi-Fi, right? IEEE 802.11. So that's an IEEE standard. Okay, that's what their standard makes the physical thing work, right? The radio waves you talk to each other to the base station from your computer or your device. The IETF part of that is the IP addressing part. Okay, so all this, what you see, that circle of organizations there, they're all part of the wider internet ecosystem, and very much so they're part of the technical, or should I say, the standards ecosystem within the internet ecosystem. ITU, of course, you may know the International Telecommunication Union, which is a multilateral organization. It's a UN agency. They do a lot of the telecom standards, for example, base stations, signaling for telephone systems and all that. And of course, because the lines have blurred between IP networks and the traditional TDM networks, that's also been a bit problematic. Who do you go to? Which is the correct one? You've got IETF, which gives everything away for free. ITUT, you need to be a member to develop those standards. So sometimes companies forum shop. Whichever one will adopt their standard, they go with that. But again, it's a work in progress. W3C, you guys know what W3C is? What does W3C do? Yep, what do they do?
HTML standards.
Yeah, it's the web standards, right? And HTML, XML are 2 prime examples of that. The IAB, the IR, so IETF, IRTF, and IAB all fall under the Internet Society or are attached to the Internet Society in some way or form. We are the legal home for most of these organizations. Look, I won't read through all the text, but that's just to give you a very brief overview. Now, not all of those organizations follow open standards development. Okay, IETF does. W3C does to some extent. IEEE supports open standards, but there's a membership process to develop those standards within them. ITU is very similar as well. Any questions on that? Do you know why I put up that slide? Because these are the organizations that create the standards that make the ecosystem work. So you know why standardization is important, right? Right? Everyone knows what, generally speaking, I'm not speaking about the internet, standards in general. Otherwise, you would not be able to do a lot of things if we didn't have certain standards, right? For example, A4 paper is a standard in this part of the world, except for our American friends who like the letter for some reason, letter size. But you put that piece of paper in your printer, the printer knows it's A4. The text you type on a document, you know it's A4. So it's standard, right? So the output, when the paper prints out, you know it's an A4 sheet of paper. And then if you need to file that into a folder, the folder is designed to fit in A4 paper. Or you need to put it into one of those sleeve things. It's designed to fit in A4. So it's standardized. And there's many, many other examples of that. So similarly, if we didn't have common standards, nothing would actually work. Because then interoperability becomes an issue. Interoperability is a key thing. If you have 2 systems, they need to be able to talk to each other. If they don't talk to each other, That's pretty much useless, isn't it? Let's take an example. If you have an iPhone and your friend has an Android phone, if those two devices were not interoperable, right? No matter what layer they're going through, let's not get into, is it using the iOS, or is it using the Android platform, or is it using IPv6? That's immaterial. The fact is there's many other standards that go into building those two devices, which make them talk to each other. So that when you turn your phone on, it talks to a base station from a telecom company. That base station says to that phone, okay, you are this number, and now you're connected to me. Sometimes you will see some base stations will not allow you to connect because, for example, if you're in an overseas country, your provider back home may not have an agreement with the telecom company, so you can't roam on their network, so it'll reject you. But within your own country, typically you will log on to your provider's base station, right? Similarly, your friend with the iPhone will also turn their phone on and log on to that base station. You can both dial each other's number and talk to each other. The reason for that is because they're interoperable, and there's many layers of that, again, which is out of scope of our discussion today, but just to understand how important interoperability is. Now, all of those organizations, one key thing they try and do is to make their systems interoperable. Now, interoperability is not a perfect science. There's many, many issues around interoperability, and I'll give you a classic example. If you go to a web page, right, pretty much any web page, and if you try and looking at that web page from 3 different browsers, let's say Firefox, Google Chrome, and what does Microsoft do these days? They call it something else, right? Whatever they call it, Edge. Still? Okay. So you use the browser to have a look at that web page. And what you will see is that there'll be differences in the way they look, right? And I see a lot of nodding heads. Why? Why is there a difference? Tell me.
The rendering web page is different.
They render differently. They interpret the coding differently, right? Even though there's a standardized, HTML is standardized, XML is standardized, but still the interpretation is still a problem. And the other big problem you'll see is, when they try and build a page, right? The margins of this text boxes and all that. So even though we've achieved so much in terms of interoperability, there's still issues. There's still some basic issues that remain. Now, when we talk about the internet ecosystem, we don't only want to talk about the English language, do we? This room is very diverse. Each of you, there's probably, 20 odd languages that we speak in this room. So imagine that interoperability issue now if we take it to with the content angle. Okay. So now you start seeing how important interoperability is. As I said, it's not a perfect science. There's still lots and lots of problems with it. With the internationalized domain names, internationalized email systems, there's a lot of things we need to fix. But we'll fix them as we go. Because if we wait for it to be fixed before we start, it may not quite work out the way we want it to work out. I've already talked about the network infrastructure service providers. We've already talked about why the domain name system is so important. We have network operators. These are your ISPs, your telecom companies, your research and education networks that build, design, and run networks. They're hosting and cloud service providers. So, if you're hosting a website somewhere, Amazon Cloud Services, for example, and there's many, many examples around the world now. If you want to build stuff, you put it on the web so it's easily accessible from wherever you are. One thing that, most people don't pay too much attention to is internet exchange points, which is something a lot of the ISTA community has been working on for several years now. Now, if, let's say, you have 2 ISPs in a country, now, historically, what's happened is they may have different ways to connect to the global internet, right? As an example, one ISP may be connecting to Hong Kong. The other ISP may be connecting to someone in Singapore. Then they access the global internet. If you are on ISP A and your friend is on ISP B, if within the country those 2 ISPs are not interconnected, what will happen is if you send them an email or an image, let's say, that's going to go to them. From there, it'll go to Hong Kong. Then it'll go to the global internet, then try and find a route to where your friend's ISP is connecting via Singapore to wherever they're connecting, and then it'll flow all the way back through. So do you see what's happening? Let's say we're in Thailand, and one ISP goes to Hong Kong, one goes to Singapore. And let's assume those 2 ISPs further down, their transit providers, don't actually connect in the region. Let's assume they connect in the US, right? So that data has to go all the way to the US and then come back all the way in again. So that's why an internet exchange point is important. What that will do is that within the country, those ISPs will connect to each other. So if there's any, and the IXP will look at where it came from and where it's going, and will decide, this is local. I don't need to send this to the global internet to come back in again. I will just send it locally via this little switch that we put in. Okay. Do you understand why that is important? Right? Because you're saving bandwidth, but what's the other thing you are minimizing? Any technical guys? Time, speed, yeah, but there's a particular word I'm looking. Latency, right? Latency. If you look at a lot of the current applications on the internet, be it video, voice, even a lot of cloud services, they're very latency dependent. So latency means the time it takes for something to go somewhere and come back to you again. So let's say a ping, right? It goes and comes back to you. The longer that latency is, the longer it takes for something to go somewhere, the greater the impact on you. For example, let's say if you're talking to someone on the phone and the latency is 1 second. So 1 second is 1001, that's 1 second, right? If you say hello, he'll or she will hear you 1 second later, which is not very useful if you're having a very intense conversation or if you're having a fight on the phone, right? Because, and assume if the latency increases to 5 or 6 seconds, okay? And do you have that case where you're calling someone, let's say on WhatsApp or something like this, can you hear me? Can you hear me? You have that thing going, right? The network is trying to find an efficient route to the person you're talking to. And sometimes there's congestion on the network. Sometimes the routing is not very efficient. And that's why you have that break in the conversation. So that's why latency is also very, very important, particularly as we move to very high-end multimedia services in terms of applications and services. So that's why IXPs play a very, very important role. Just some pictures, that's a list of Tier 1 ISPs. So you know how ISPs work, right? So if you have an ISP in your country, they're connected to the global internet by another ISP, a bigger, let's say a wholesale ISP. And that wholesale ISP will connect further back to what might be called, what's typically called a transit provider. So these transit providers have cables running all over the globe, all over Asia, and they interconnect countries and so on and so forth. So it's a multi-level approach to where you buy the bandwidth from. So if your ISP, there are very few ISPs who are big enough to own their own submarine cable networks. But these guys on the left are some of them. So these are some big players. So typically, your ISP in your country, at some point in that connection, it'll go through one of their networks in the Asia Pacific, as an example. Not always, but just as an example. This map here was supposed to give an overview of the submarine cables, and download the presentation and you can open up that image to see a better picture of it. And you'll see the number of cables that exist under the sea is quite incredible. And these pictures here are people fixing those underwater submarine cables. Now, it's a major, major exercise. Many years ago, I had a company that did submarine cable networks. And the time and effort it takes to do these things, people don't realize it. You just expect your connection to work. Do you guys remember a couple of years ago, or recently in fact, there were some cable breaks? A cable of Taiwan broke, a cable of Egypt broke, yeah, and there was a few others around the globe. And there was massive impact, right? There's one off Vietnam as well that broke. There's massive impact because suddenly what happens, that connection doesn't exist anymore. There's all that data assuming that it can go down that pipe. Then it says, oops, I can't go anywhere. What do I do now? And so the network starts slowing down. The routers try and reroute all the information, and it becomes quite a mess. So, sometimes when your technical guys say, oh, the cable's down, try and think of the bigger picture. What if the big cable is down? Imagine all the effort they need to go to fix those things, right? Some pictures of infrastructure. Now, to make your internet work, what is that one very core thing that you need? No.
Connection.
Even more important than that. That's the one, electricity. If there's no power, your internet is not going to work. Okay, simple as that. And that electricity is very, very important. That's why you see all these data centers and all that. They've got massive backup generators in place to ensure that the power keeps going. Now extend that to countries in this region where electricity supply, if you have a 24 hours of electricity supply would be called a luxury. Yeah, power goes off every so often. South Asia in particular, in some parts of Southeast Asia. So imagine if we want to now bring all those people online and we want to have cloud systems in place and everything's online, all applications are online. But if your power goes off for 5 hours a day, it's not very useful, is it? So that's why we need to ensure that, so even part of that wider ecosystem are the power companies, because they help provide the power that makes our systems and networks run. Okay. Now comes that big box called the users. What makes up a user? Anyone care to offer me some opinions? What's an internet user? Who's an internet user?
Everyone.
Who's everyone? Us and?
Subscribers, service providers,
Manufacturers, operators.
So fundamentally, everyone is a user. Right? Every stakeholder category you saw before, each of them is a user as well. Okay. Of course,
part of the ecosystem.
it's part of the ecosystem, right? They may have other roles in the ecosystem as well, but if you're on the internet, you're a user. Either you're a billion-dollar company, or you are the little push cart guy in the corner of the street who's using his phone to order his meat or vegetables or whatever that he does is stir fry down the street here, right? On the corner food carts that you have on the streets. So everyone is a user, and that's why it really complicates things because sometimes what happens, we as users don't realize what the needs of our other user colleagues are. Okay. Governments will think at the government level, the big companies will think at the enterprise level, the telecom companies will be more concerned about their own networks and operations. But this is why we need to ensure that the whole user community is taken into account. Now, what are these names? Who are these companies? You know most of them, or a good number of them, I hope? Who are they? Yeah, device manufacturers, largely speaking, right? Okay. And some very big names. Huh? Panasonic is massive. Sony is massive. Okay. Cisco, obviously there's Cisco there. Huawei should be there too, but I think we forgot to put them up. But Huawei is a major player now, as is ZTE, I should say. Here's some more. Know those names too? What are these names? Who are they? Yeah, software, application providers, content providers, systems providers. Yeah. Okay. And that slide there is probably worth, I don't know, $10 trillion maybe. I don't know, something like that. Yeah. Well, you go Google there, which is already something. That's a lot of money on that slide. Yeah. These guys are also users too, right? You know what Google Play is, right? For those of you on Android, right? You can't live without Google Play, right? It keeps on asking. Every couple of weeks I get it asking me, do you accept my terms and services? Conditions and terms and conditions of services. I just said yes last week, but they keep on asking me every week. I don't know. Every time they update, they ask me. Okay. So this is the other part of users. And if you have nieces and nephews and brothers and sisters and kids, as you may, they're really into gaming these days, right? That 8, 10-year-old kid is also a user. Okay. Are his or her concerns being looked after?
Since 3-4 years they are using it.
Yeah, even that, so they're literally born with a tablet or a device, aren't they? So there's a friend of mine who once said to me that maybe what we should do, how, when a child is born, you go to the birth registrar and you do all that legal thing you need to do, right? So his idea was that, why don't we allocate them an IP address the day they're born? Yeah? Stays with them for the rest of their lives. Wouldn't that be interesting? Yeah? I'm not sure how feasible that is, but, food for thought. What are these guys? Okay, particularly AV, movies and TVs and shows like that. And these guys are big now, right? They're big. And you'll see a lot of them are starting to sort of influence a lot of the policy around the internet ecosystem. Yeah? Netflix is very active in policy, as is Apple, as is Amazon. And they work behind the scenes here to influence and advocate so that their business keeps on running. Oops, what happened here? And then, of course, if we expand it out, it just goes on and on and on. In multiple sectors: agriculture, hospitality, fintech, education, transportation, everyone's a user. And that's why, when you talk about the internet ecosystem, and then when you start talking about how the internet ecosystem works on internet governance, remember I said it gets very complicated? This is why it gets very complicated, because each of those entities, each of those companies will have their own thing about what they want, what is their, against, and these are food companies, these are oil companies. It just goes on and on and on. Okay, so I won't go through all that. And then, of course, there's the individual users. Now, if you look at China and India, the two largest countries in this region, they have 1 billion users between them already. That's roughly 1/3 of the global internet population. Okay. So a question for you guys. So how do you know, knowing that India and China are the largest internet markets in the world, they have the most users, in fact, they have more internet users than countries have populations, right? What role does India and China play in the internet ecosystem? A very open question. Historically, the US has been the internet superpower, right? It's no longer the case, I don't think. If you look at the equipment manufacturers, companies like Huawei and ZTE, Huawei has more employees than Cisco. They have more R&D centers than Cisco. Sorry? 4 minutes. Yes, sir. Told you, throw something at me. India has this, there's quite a few people from India in the room. They've got the Make in India, the Digital India program, right? And you can see a lot of companies in there moving their manufacturing base to India, because if you want to sell your devices in India, if you don't make in India, you cannot sell, or you get hit with high tariff rates, right? So, but back to my question, what role does India and China play in the internet governance ecosystem?
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Since you're asking a couple of times. One remarkable initiative is by Alibaba on an e-payment system. They decide to coordinate global e-payment system, in particular for the small and medium enterprise. And we'll see if it succeeds. Second, as you said, it's a 3GPP. Somehow, first of all, your diagram missed a 3GPP, which is very important.
Yeah.
In the 3GPP, they decided the 3G, 4G, 5G. Do you know who are the major players in the 5G? China, Korea, Japan, and the USA. 3 out of 4 is here in Asia.
In Asia.
And so we are in the driving seat. And probably we want to, this is a done deal. By now, 5G is basically Asia decide. But this payment system, we don't know if the Alibaba is going to succeed, or the Amazon and those US.
The other ones, yeah.
It's a very severe competition, and we'll see how things develop.
So,
you may comment if you have any.
So Professor Chon has preempted what I was going to close my session with, but anyway. So the reason I kept on asking that question was, so what, as Professor Chon very clearly said, what's happened is that they are now starting to influence those standards making, that industry consortiums that are coming into play, the industry standards that are coming into play. And the CJK countries, China, Japan, and Korea, are obviously very active on that front. Another very quick example I'll give you before we get into the discussion part of things. Have you guys heard of WeChat? Yeah, does anyone use WeChat? Some of you do, yeah? But obviously not all of you are from China, right? If you use WeChat in China, it's very different to the WeChat you use outside. In China, WeChat is a complete ecosystem on its own. There's literally nothing you can't do on WeChat. Buy your rail tickets, your air tickets, send payments, send money to a friend, buy cinema tickets, sell goods, receive goods. I mean, it's amazing. I was in China last month for MWC Shanghai, and I sat down with a chap from Tencent, which owns WeChat. And we had a very interesting conversation on what they see as the future. Where they've stumbled is, so if you see WeChat is obviously, it owns the market in China, right? It owns the market in China. So we move to the discussion partner, right? So don't throw something at me. And what's happened is that within China, they've been able to build that full A to Z ecosystem. Now, whether that is good or bad, that's an open question, right? That's something we can maybe discuss later on as well. Should one company own the whole ecosystem, right? I mean, Facebook is also trying to do this, right? In parts of South Asia, there's been lots of, in India in particular, there's been lots of issues around that, and the public have pushed back on that, free basics and zero rating and all this sort of stuff. But Facebook, Facebook is nowhere near what WeChat is in China. I mean, I would say Facebook would aspire to be what WeChat is in China. But if you use WeChat outside, let's say here in Thailand or in Singapore where I use it, you don't get all the features they do get from China itself, which is interesting. So in these discussions I had with this couple of chaps from WeChat, what they were saying was that, in China they've been able to build that because they've been able to work within the cultural constraints of how people, the trust mechanisms in place locally, what alternatives they could provide to other providers, and people said, hey, this is much easier to use. But trying to translate that outside of China has been problematic, and that's why they haven't really succeeded much yet. So that's why you see a lot of the features you get in China on WeChat are not available outside of China. There's also jurisdiction issues and all that, but aside from all those legal perspectives. But imagine if you had one company that suddenly had this platform globally, which gave you everything you wanted. So my question to you is, would you be happy living in that company's ecosystem? Could be Facebook, could be something new, could be WeChat, whatever it is. But if that one company provided you everything, even your device, why not?
Yeah, it would be a restriction, like you would be just limited to that one company. Because it would be completely, like you would be restricted to one company, and you would not be allowed to explore other possibilities or other standards. So whatever they throw at you, it's just the limitation. It would be something like, internet would be that device, or internet would be the whole world, whereas there's so much to explore, and internet itself is evolving, so it would limit you.
So
I would say that I would not go for that, because I think that I would be living under a radar of one company who would have all my data. Whatever I'm doing, when I'm socializing, whatever I'm doing on the internet, they would have all my data. So I don't want that my data or my personal life should be shared with one company or whoever manages it. So
is there anyone who agrees that it would be a good idea to have one company? I mean, imagine the convenience, right? It gives you everything you want. Why make life complicated?